Ah, yes. The Nerf Star Wars line. The Nerf Star Wars line. Now, Nerf Star Wars line has always been kind of a controversial Nerf series. And that's because of how expensive it was. It was like double the price than it actually showed. But it was for good reason. And that was because that most of the Nerf blasters, like the Kira, when you pull the trigger, it made a sound. And it took batteries to do that. So it actually kind of felt like you were shooting lasers from your Nerf dart, from your Nerf gun. And then there's also the Captain Calcium's blaster, which was a single-shot blaster. And it also was very weird because of how you would prime it. And then there's also the Stormtrooper blaster, which was like the jolt of, which was like the jolt of the Star Wars line because they remade it a few times. Unfortunately, didn't make any sound. But to the Nerf Star Wars line's credit, it did have some pretty decent blasters, like the Chewbacca Glow Strike blaster and the Death Trooper blaster. However, one Nerf blaster that they made for this single-handedly killed this line of Nerf blasters. This Nerf blaster was so bad that they basically stopped making Star Wars blasters that weren't from the Nerf Limited line after this release. Now, I know I talked about this Nerf blaster before, but in that review, I never really realized how bad it was. Ladies and gentlemen, the blaster that single-handedly wiped out the Star Wars line. The Nerf Mandalorian blaster, or Nerf Mandalorian pistol. I'll call it the Nerf Mandalorian blaster because that's what it said in the packaging, and that's what it said on Amazon. But look at this. This deserves an apology to the entire society. Now, with other Nerf blasters I have covered in this series, the Flip 16, the Rev Reaper, at least it didn't single-handedly wipe out their series. It took Zombie Strike 4 years to end after the Rev Reaper came out, and it took the Flip 16 3 more years after it came out for Elite 2.0 to end. And I know what you're thinking about the Ravager. Well, the Ravager, Alien Menace was done on arrival. After the Ravager and that other blaster that came out, I forgot what its name was like the Insider? I don't even know what it was called. That line was dead on arrival, and after the Ravager came out, the Voidcaster came out 1 year later. But this is one of the only Nerf blasters that has straight up ended a series because of how bad it is. Not to mention, this blaster has been made before. The Han Solo blaster. This is literally the same blaster, but in Mandalorian art, which does look kind of cool. I will say that. The blaster does look kind of cool. But looks can be deceiving, as they say. And to prove that it's literally the same blaster as the Han Solo blaster, and that one Ray blaster they made about 6 to 7 years prior, it can only hold 4 darts. That dart's not good. If you thought that the Flip 16 was a mechanical mess, watch this. So, the first shot. Let me move the corner, guys. I just want to use that later. Here's the first shot. It does work. Second shot. Does work. Third shot. Does work. Fourth shot does work. But here's what I mean by mechanical mess. This Nerf gun jams so much, and it's not even funny. Yeah. And you know what's even worse about this blaster? For the standards of the Star Wars line, 4 shots is high capacity. Yeah. That's the thing. Nerf Star Wars barely even made any Nerf blasters that were higher than 3 darts in the capacity. This, along with the very few magazine Nerf blasters that they made, and also the carbon copies of this blaster they made, like the Han Solo blaster, which I just mentioned, and then the Ray Kaiju blaster, I think that's what it's called. First shot works. Second shot works. Third shot barely even made it to the target, and the target, it's like 3 feet away from the Nerf blaster that I'm pointing right now. The definitive way of using this Nerf blaster that will not make it jam every 5 seconds is by doing this. You load up your darts, and then you gotta point your Nerf blaster down like you're using a giant protractor, close it, and then you can fire it. And it still barely even hit the target. Here, look at this. Look at this. This is how far I am away from the Nerf target I'm using right now. Like 2 to 3 feet away. And it would still barely even hit the target. If you thought that Russian roulette was dangerous, imagine if this was an actual gun. Imagine if this was an actual gun, and you're held at gunpoint, and then you're pointing this gun at the person that is aiming at you. And then there is a chance, like a 1 in 6 chance, just like Russian roulette, that the gun will basically jam. Imagine if this was a real gun. This is how bad it is. I'm gonna fire it one more time before the chronograph. Oh yeah, and also loading it is kind of tedious because it's an internal magazine blaster, so if you do one thing wrong, if you load it in wrong, then you're basically screwed. Oh, there it is. It jammed. Just like that. So yeah, if it jams, and because it's an internal magazine blaster, trying to fix it is a pain in the butt. See that? It barely even hit the target. I hate everything about this Nerf blaster. This is probably on my top 3 of worst Nerf blasters ever made. The only 2 Nerf blasters I can think of that are even worse are the Disruptor, which, just so you know, I broke 2 Disruptors, and the Ravager. Let's get the chronograph on. I don't even want to use this blaster anymore. I want to get this over with. And this is take number 2 of this video. This is take number 2. This is how bad this Nerf blaster is. Why do I even bother? .41 flat. Here, let me get the chronograph closer so you guys can see me using it. 45.8. 39.2, and final shot, 53.7. So not only is using this blaster like Russian roulette, it's also very inconsistent with its firing range. It went from a little bit under 40 feet per second to over 50 feet per second. What is that effort dart? There it is. Let's fire it a few more times, shall we? Just to give you more of a visual of how awful this Nerf blaster is. And just so you know, I am priming it the way you're supposed to, instead of just doing it like a protractor or whatnot. 23.0. 49.4. 47 flat. 43, no, not 43, 45.3. One more time, shall we? One dart. And just so you know, these are the dart zone darts. I'm using these with the dart zone darts. Imagine how bad they would be with the darts that they came with. Imagine how bad with the standard Nerf Elite darts. 27.9. Again, this is like the fifth time that it barely even hit the target. That is like 3 feet away from where I'm aiming. 45.7. 54.1. That is the highest so far, just so you know. And 38.3. If you see this Nerf blaster, do not buy it. The Mandalorian blaster is the worst Star Wars blaster, period. And it was the last. After this Nerf blaster, I can't even think of any Star Wars Nerf blaster that was released. Except for the EE3, which isn't even considered a Star Wars blaster because it was from Nerf Limited, as opposed to the Star Wars blaster. As opposed to the Star Wars line. I'm even messing up what I think I'm supposed to say. Because about this how bad this blaster is. This blaster is an abomination. This blaster deserves to be incinerated. This might be the worst Nerf blaster ever made. Period. Maybe even worse than the Disruptor. If it single-handedly killed off an entire line of Nerf blasters, that should give you a gold star of how bad you are. And this might have even killed off Nerf as a whole. Because after this, 1 year later, they decided to make Nerf N-Series, which has been kind of a flop as of recent, because of how many times they've remade the ward. This, if you see it, do not buy it. Do not buy it. Absolute garbage. The Mandalorian blaster may be the worst Nerf blaster ever made. It's at least in the top 3 of worst Nerf blasters I have in my collection. So anyways, if you enjoyed what you watched, make sure you like, subscribe, share a video with a friend, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.